First question is for you, Jane, and that was the. I'm not sure how quickly you can answer this, but about the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, why it was set up and how it was set up.
Can you hear me?
Sorry.
Is it better if I stay sitting down? I can't see you, but you can hear me. We'll swing the mic between us. It came about from a very clear commitment from the Labour Party going into 1997 that we would seek to achieve it. Mo Mowlam was actually the shadow Secretary of State, so it was clear that if we had have won, as we in the end eventually did, she was going to go into that role. That was always the plan. And Mo Mowlam brought to the job somebody who had no history of commenting on the situation. She was a fresh set of eyes and a very strong personality with a really deep well of empathy and ability to engage. And so with all of those personal strengths, she was able to talk to people that perhaps previously, but ministers in the previous Conservative governments and perhaps former Labour spokespeople had not been able to engage with. So there was we felt that, I say we collectively, it was felt that we had an opportunity, a window of opportunity to make a change. We committed to it and then set a deadline. And the deadline was the April deadline, and it only just got in under the wire.
And there is a supplementary question to that, asking if Chris Patten faced opposition to A, getting rid of the B specials, and B, setting up the PSNI.
Absolutely. To both of those, as I tried to explain in my contribution, within the body of the Royal Ulster Constabulary were officers and staff who were professional in what they did. They understood the personal risks that they took, and they felt they were not valued and understood. And previous bad decisions or bad practice or rogue, or playing decisions and actions that caused the reputation of the RUC to be undermined and caused some communities not to have confidence in the Royal Ulster Constabulary, weighed heavily in the peace process. And we had to figure out how we were going to address that. If Northern Ireland was going to go to a normal, what we all think of as a normal, peaceful society, police had to be able to do their job. John, in the documents we talk about being able to police without fear or favour. That means you investigate everybody, irrespective of their background or their political position or anything that views that they might have about the police. And we were a long way in Northern Ireland from that situation. So the police had to change as an institution. Now you've got a body of men and women who said, why? What's wrong with what we've done? 300 of our colleagues have been killed. What is wrong with what we have done? And we had to take them, and the Chief Constable was Ronnie Flanagan. At the time, we probably couldn't have achieved it without the quality of a leader like Sir Ronnie Flanagan, who was very held in the highest regard within the RUC, and he persuaded the RUC as an institution to agree to the change. It was considered at the time to be the biggest single public sector change programme anywhere in Europe. And as part of the police dividend, we were to shrink the size of the police, we were to remove some of the big army posts and the bases, and all of that was predicated upon the other side also coming along the same path. So risks were being taken on both sides, and the RUC and the officers and staff came even reluctantly to accept that the change had to be made. And the evidence of that is in the fact that it was made. And I just think it couldn't have been achieved without those individuals within that institution saying, okay, we get that you don't appreciate what we've done in the past, but we want to continue working towards peace and also delivering justice, which is what the vast majority of ordinary decent people, we used to call them ordinary decent people in Northern Ireland, want the same thing, irrespective of the cultural background.
Thank you. And now, if I can ask Celia, I think your comments on the role of climate change particularly awoke in the audience a lot of thoughts. Somebody did comment, I've just heard another version of Laudato Si. And the idea was floated, and I wonder if we'd have your comments on this, is a solution to be found to the boundaries that are a consequence of climate change to be found in integral ecology and sustainable development goals.
So I think probably, I'm sure part of the answer is to be found there, and I think that the role of, so the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals provide a really important framework and a pathway out of some of the dynamics that I talked about at the beginning of my presentation. I think the challenge for all of us is to hold our governments to account for fulfilling the commitments that they signed up to with that UN process, and also with the Paris climate change agreements. So it's up to our governments, and it's up to us as citizens to ensure that our governments live up to their responsibilities and don't see these things as just tasks for people in other parts of the world who are more immediately affected by the consequences, but commitments for all of us who share the planet together. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I have a question now, which I would like to, with different dimensions, ask both our speakers. The event which occurred almost exactly 2 years ago before our Justice and Peace Assembly, the Brexit vote. Obviously, I'll ask Jane first. There is an obvious particular relevance to Northern Ireland, but I think also a broader question which I will ask Celia. Jane, do you want to comment on that, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland?
It's been really, I'm a bystander now, and what we know about the situation in Northern Ireland is that the acceptance of the border is limited. There are communities in Northern Ireland who quite legitimately, in a democracy, believe that Ireland should be one united country. And Brexit is the absolute opportunity for that to be realised. And I think it didn't surprise me that there was a walkout at the Assembly, because that just makes it all the more difficult. And within all of that difficulty, mistakes are made and opportunities arise. We always felt that there was a demographic change taking place in Northern Ireland, whereby if there was another vote on whether to keep the border or not, or if the people in Northern Ireland were ever asked, there would have been a demographic change so that those perhaps from a nationalist community might outnumber those from a unionist community, and the vote might actually go for a united Ireland. And Brexit, I think, makes that more likely rather than less.
Thank you. And widening the discussion on Brexit slightly, we're asked what difference you think it makes to the UK's relationship with friends and with enemies.
So my personal view is that Brexit is a disaster in terms of what we need, what the kinds of structures and relationships that we need to address the problems of our day, because those problems are global in nature. The planet is interconnected. Issues cross boundaries, people cross boundaries. We therefore need to be able to work across boundaries. And I think retreating from the most successful initiative in Europe in terms of building relationships of trust and confidence between nations is a big mistake. That's just my personal view. That is not to say that the European Union is all unicorns and rainbows. There's all kinds of problems with it. But I think from the point of view of peace and security, it's a pity to underestimate the significance of that project over the last 60 years. I recently completed a study of 20 national security strategies looking at how other states approach the question of security, what it means, how it's created, what their strategies are for addressing it. And it was very interesting to see that a number of European states saw the European Union as a key dimension of their security strategy. So it wasn't just that it was a means to an end. The European project was an end in itself because they believed that it would enhance the security of their society because it strengthened relationships with neighbours. So I think Brexit creates a real question about the kinds of relationships that the UK wants to have with the rest of the world in the future and the values and principles that might underpin those. And I think we've seen relatively little clarity so far in terms of what that is intended to look like. And I hope that as the conversation continues about Brexit, that we can hear a little bit more debate about the kind of vision and ideas about this, the way that the UK will relate to Europe and to the rest of the world from 2019.
Thank you. And obviously getting an echo there of approval. Jane, if I could ask you how you think the present political impasse, which you did briefly refer to before, in Northern Ireland will affect security issues, including peace?
It does bring a formal dialogue to an end, and it's actually really important that an assembly takes place, that you're formally bringing two sides of a divided community. Those divisions remain. There may be less stark than they used to be, but it will be generations before those divisions have completely worked their way out of society in Northern Ireland. And to lose that visible, obvious dialogue between those communities, which the Assembly represents, is problematic, and it's a backward step. And for that to be happening at a time when nobody can seriously envisage a hard border along the Ulster boundary, having seen that border from army helicopters and on the ground in the army bases, I know how complex that border is. There are farms that have for centuries straddled the border, and farmers being what farmers are, they've always taken advantage of whichever tax system favoured them the most. And that's a natural human situation that you cannot easily impose a strict national solution to. It isn't going to work, and the economics of it are really serious for both sides of the border and for the UK as a whole. The whole Brexit project should just be put on a leaking ship and shoved off into the ocean.
And this question is, I think, perhaps within your remit, Celia, although it's an extremely difficult question, I think, and you might both want to comment. Some people say it's impossible to dialogue with ISIS. Is there any way through?
Okay, so I think this is a great question and a really important question. And the knee-jerk response when this question comes up in media debate is no, it's not possible, because they have a kind of apocalyptic worldview, and they're not interested in dialogue, and the acts, the atrocities that they commit mean that they do not have a legitimate right to be at the table to discuss their demands. And I can understand where those ideas come from. But I think we need we need to dig a little bit deeper. And I think the first question to ask is, who is ISIS? Because ISIS in Iraq has very different origins from ISIS in Syria, which has very different origins from ISIS in Libya, or ISIS who claim responsibility for attacks in other parts of Europe, including the United Kingdom. So I think the first task is to understand ISIS in its context. Who is ISIS? What are the conditions that led to them forming in the way that they have? And how do they see themselves in relation to the social and political context that they're operating in? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is to think about who is it we're talking about that needs to have this dialogue with ISIS. I think it's probably pretty inconceivable that the UK government has a dialogue with ISIS. But that's not necessarily the starting point. There will be people on the ground in Syria and in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East who have no choice but to talk to ISIS because they encounter them on a day-to-day basis in their communities. And just as at certain times in conflict, it's very hard for political leaders to admit they're talking. There are always conversations going on the ground because in the end these are human beings with human relationships and social networks that work in complicated ways. So I think it's about understanding where those conversations need to take place and about what. And once we start to think in this more complex way about who this organisation is and what might be appropriate in different contexts, we start to find entry points. So I don't think there's going to be a grand political negotiation with ISIS in that sense, between ISIS and the West. But I think there may be strategies that are context specific that allow problems to start to be explored through dialogue. That doesn't mean legitimising their demands or their actions, and I think they should be held accountable for the atrocities that they've committed, but I don't think it needs to rule out conversation.
I wondered if you wanted to comment, because it's a clear echo, I think.
Yes, I agree with Celia about the comments she makes about ISIS or Daesh, as I prefer to think of them. It isn't a homogenous group. It doesn't have, in my understanding, it doesn't have a clear structure that you could connect to, and there probably isn't the same discipline within their organisation for, insofar as it is an organisation and not an ideology. And from what I know of the way in which our security services are seeking to prevent attacks here, it is the threat comes from young people or people who are radicalised and connected with here through the internet with people like in Daesh, in ISIS as an organisation, insofar as it has one, or other radical groups, and that connection causes the young person or the person being radicalised here to carry out the act of terror here. And it is so much more difficult to connect with something like that, to try and understand the ideology and then prevent it. So we get a lot of debate about does prevent work, the strategy. There is an actual strategy called prevent. Very difficult in the circumstances in which our security services are operating. Very high degree of risk, because whereas we used to deal with terrorist organisations that were structured and had discipline and then developed political wings, we are not dealing with that now. We're not threatened by that now, and our security is dependent upon our security services constantly being lucky. As I said earlier, it's better to be lucky than good, but it's good that they're good as well.
Thank you. My next question is a question for you, Celia, because I think a lot of people in the audience, myself included, felt this was a completely different way of looking at things. And so the question is, could you give us a simple first step to equipping ourselves to get out and influence the public debate around how to ensure security? And the person has put in brackets, it could be as simple as drawing attention to your organisation's website.
So it is a bit daunting, I think, thinking about how do we generate debate about security. What I've found most effective for the last couple of years is starting the conversation by asking people, what is it that makes you feel secure in your life? And what is it that makes you feel insecure? And everybody has got their own personal response to that question based on their own life experience. But I have found it a really powerful way to start opening up conversations about what security actually means and what people's experiences are of what creates security in their own lives. And then you kind of broaden it out to their community and the wider society. So I think debates can begin with those questions, and people can share those experiences and recognise that they've all got an opinion and some ideas about what's worked and what hasn't worked for them in their lives. But so we have a number of resources on our website for doing this kind of work. So we've developed some materials for use in schools or in youth settings. So, and it's primarily about encouraging people to critically engage with the question of what security is in a way that is relevant and kind of accessible. So it's not necessarily presenting kind of big theories of how the world works, but just encouraging people to start from where they are. And all of that material is available on our website. We've also got some resources for doing more kind of work with adults through kind of dialogue and workshops. So I hope that's a starting point, and if people want to use it, they're very welcome, and feedback is always helpful.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And now it's a question for each of you. Sorry, one each, because I realise we're getting near the end of our time, so I'll address one question to each of you. The first question for Jane is, what difference would the removal of all borders from countries make to increasing the role of security for people and planet? After all, nature, animals, and the spread of any species doesn't hold to any such restrictions. So, your thoughts on that? It's a rather radical suggestion.
Well, considering we are in a Christian institution, I do think that the Tower of Babel story does indicate that we are tribal. There is within us a natural instinct to band together in groups, in tribes, in organisations, in countries. So in an ideal world, you would have no borders. But in an ideal world, you would have no crime or hunger. Everybody would have shelter. Everybody would, the sheep would lie down, the lion would lie down with the lamb. Or that would be, and remains obviously, our ideal for human beings to live together. We're not there. We're quite a long way from that, I'm afraid. It's very interesting. 150 years ago, Robert Peel wrote the Peelian Principles that define British policing as we know it today. And one of those says the success of policing is the absence of a police presence. Is that about right, Elaine? So he was arguing that in a society that doesn't need the police, you've succeeded. But so long as you need them in some numbers, and we haven't got enough.
Thank you. And Celia, a question for you. What do you think the role of our economic capitalist mode of production plays in the need for the militarisation of the world?
In a minute.
So I think the current model of capitalism is one of the most significant drivers of global insecurity, because what it's overseeing at the moment is the transfer of wealth on a massive scale from the majority world to the elite. So I think, and I think it's such a big problem that it's very hard for our politicians to engage with, because the solutions and the transition is incredibly complicated, and there isn't a model yet out there that doesn't contain structural violence of some kind, an economic model. So the answers are difficult to find, but nonetheless, I think it's at the heart of the problems. And I think what we see in terms of how that relates to militarisation is that the economic elite mobilise the military to secure the system from which they derive their power and their influence. And so the global arms trade is part of securing and reinforcing the capitalist system, which also makes it incredibly difficult to dismantle and start to think about differently. So those are the problems facing us. I'm sorry, that leaves us as rather a kind of, it's a big nut to crack, isn't it? But I think recognising that's what we need to engage with is an important part of the problem.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask one final question, and I'll ask both our speakers to answer this question, and then I'm going to read out something which is relevant to that, I think, which Tom Cullinan has handed to me. I think, Jane, in your talk, you referred to the idea of a slight on sacrifice, and I think actually that whole idea is interesting. And the question is, how do you counteract this within a community or beyond? But what's your thoughts?
I'll give you a personal anecdote. When I was a student and not long out of university, I wore a white poppy. I chose to seek out a white poppy. You couldn't buy them easily, but I got one and wore it. And I remember thinking, nonetheless, I want to go and remember the sacrifice of the fallen. So I went to the cenotaph. And I remember standing with families and thinking, this isn't right. It's not as if their choice to wear the red poppy makes them in favour of war. And I stopped wearing the white poppy then and changed to wearing the red one. I'm not a pacifist by any means, but I am not, nobody would advance war as a policy. It's always an indication of failure, of political failure. And I feel that those who have fallen in a war, one of the reasons why for decades within Parliament it was the common practice for an opposition, if a government went to war, for the opposition to not criticise the decision to go to war. If you remember the Falklands War, we went through a very difficult period when Michael Foot, who was then leader of the Labour Party, refrained from criticising the decision, despite being a long-standing pacifist himself. And the reason for that was men and women were dying in that war. And it was felt, I remember it very distinctly, that to not support the action in which they were involved, in the sense that you were supporting them, was to undermine the respect for their sacrifice. So even if we might have felt that the Falklands War could have been handled differently, we didn't articulate that in Parliament, because to do that would be to undermine the confidence of the families whose men and women were out there paying the ultimate sacrifice. And if you think of how the debate has broken open around Iraq, there's very much more anxiety amongst families who feel as if their people have died in vain because there was no united front on the Iraq war. Now, I'm not arguing that, at the time I voted in particular ways around Iraq and voted to go into war, given what we knew at the time. And there has been a sea change in that attitude. And I think there is a difference now in the way that soldiers and their families, particularly those families who lose a loved one, think about the whole thing. If there's a division within society and it is overt, there is much more of a sense that you should never have sent him. If you couldn't agree, if there couldn't be an agreement in the country, what on earth were you doing sending our sons and daughters over there.
Thank you. Celia, would you like to comment on that question there, the idea that of the slight on sacrifice?
So I think in terms of how do you avoid the slight on sacrifice, I think the most important thing is acknowledgement. And I think acknowledging the sacrifice and the suffering that results from armed violence is really important, and honouring that sacrifice. And I definitely respect what Jane has to say about the importance of respecting the decisions and the agency of soldiers who go out to fight. I think it is possible to respect those men and women and still question the decision about particular wars. And I do believe that a debate about going to war is one of the most important debates that a society can have, given the consequences of the actions, not only for the soldiers but for the populations where they're sent to fight. So I actually welcome the fact that there is much more debate now about questions of military intervention, not least because the main military interventions of the last 15 years have been largely catastrophic and have generated significant amounts of insecurity. I think it is really important to explore those, and I think the Chilcot inquiry was a really important process, however long it took. I don't think that should take away from the sacrifice of those individual men and women who went to fight, and I do appreciate the risk that the debate raises questions about the legitimacy of the decisions that are being taken, but I think those decisions are so important that the discussion matters. So I know it's a difficult question, but if the debate can be respectful, I think it's a really important one.
Thank you for that, thank you. I mean, I think it is something that we're all in different ways aware of, that sense. And so I'd like to conclude. This has been thank you both, first of all, for the answers you've given to some very searching questions. And I think it's been a productive debate or discussion. But I'd like to read these words which Father Tom Cullinan handed to me a few minutes ago, because they're very much relevant, I think, to that last question. In most memorial services, in most talks on violence and peace, we recall and remember, but we do not realise that those who have died are more with us here today than before they were killed. The one whom you loved and have lost is more with you now than before he or she died. And that's from John Chrysostom. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.